boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today a political and economic writer. He's a specialist on China, speaks Chinese, lived in China, studied in China, has a podcast called China Unraveled, and is currently in the works of producing a book on China itself. I want to introduce to you today Jason Szeftel. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So you have lived in China how long?
So I was there on and off between 2010 and 2015. So it was I was sort of in and out. I was in Beijing and then I was out, but it was multiple months over the period.
And what brought you there?
So I've had an interest in China basically forever. I grew up in a house where I had a brother who had some sort of disabilities, and there was a Chinese guy who was around the whole time to helping him out. He was sort of the guy who did that. And then, I was always fascinated by it. Then basically 9/11 happened. The U.S. got into wars in the Middle East. And I was always wondering in the back of my mind, like, what's going on with China? It's back there. It's big. It's old. Seems to be growing powerful. Meanwhile, we got all these Middle Eastern misadventures going on. And I got fascinated. And then I got a scholarship to study in China, learn Chinese, and I was there. And then it sort of just spiraled. And I'd probably still be going there. But after 2014, 2015, the way things moved in the politics and the way I talk about things, they don't mesh, to say the least. So that became pretty impossible. Yeah. If I go back to China, I'll be in Taiwan.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the university you went to, where was it?
So that was Beijing University, Peking University. In Chinese, they call it Beida, so it's in Beijing. There's sort of two major universities in Beijing, Tsinghua and Beida, and those are sort of the two. And I was at, one of them. Doesn't mean anything to say which one. It's like, it's over more northwest or something.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Was your major in Chinese language, or was it something else and you just studied Chinese while you were there?
Yeah, so I studied Chinese while I was there, and I was actually focused on large developmental systems. So I was studying agriculture, infrastructure, energy, all these sorts of things. And if people go read online the stuff I write, you'll see like, wow, he wrote this sort of big thing on energy, big thing on agriculture, big thing on space. Yeah. That's sort of the way I go about things. And I was trying to figure out what made this country tick, not sort of like, oh, I can speak and I know how to say bus or something in Chinese. It's like, it was more like, how do the pieces of China come together? Do they fit? Yeah. Why does its history look the way it does? Why does its culture look the way it does? And that pulled me. And so my Chinese is actually really terrible these days because I realized I couldn't find what I wanted in the language. And I looked back and I'm like, even ancient Chinese is kind of like Middle English. It's like, you can't read that. And what you learn in China is simplified Chinese. It's not the stuff they wrote before. So so it pulled me back. And so the way I look at things is there's a lot of war, a lot of military, a lot of agriculture, economics, history, geography. That's the stuff that came together to really help me get an understanding of the country.
Well, I feel a little bit shallow myself. Whatever I pick up from a language, it's hey, how do I order these noodles? Or hey, you look good. I mean, that's a very base.
I mean, that's what it means.
Yeah,
that's what it really means to speak.
What about the system and how do you?
Well, well, it's like once you start doing that, learning the language, it kind of just fell on the back burner. I was like, well, to really keep up my Chinese, I would have had to stay in China all the time, and that didn't work, especially when I was in Beijing. Beijing is pretty filthy. Just the air quality, all that kind of stuff. There's things we take for granted that, particularly I was there in the summer a lot, and the summer you can like stare at the sun because there was so much smog blocking it.
That's an interesting comment because I dare say the pictures that I see from Beijing don't show that. They show this nice, beautiful city, organized, clean, no trash, no people either, but it's like very nice looking little shots of scenery. And the impression is given, we're so organized and developed and we have these systems that everything just works magically here. You should adopt it.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the play, right? Propaganda is like a cabinet level position in China, if that makes sense, right? And I mean that literally. Yes. So like before the Beijing Olympics, they went on a cleanup spree. They started telling everyone in Beijing not to, have their shirts, their stomachs exposed with their shirts up, and to not be doing things in the streets, not be littering. They were trying to clean up everything to put on a big grand show.
Yes.
It's normal. I mean, that's kind of how they go about things. And yeah, they want everyone to think that they're the super developed and advanced.
Right.
Sure.
But so after the propaganda event, basically everybody pulls their shirt back up and throws trash on the street. Is that how it works?
That was pretty much how it happened in Beijing, for sure. They couldn't keep it up. They were like, "You're gonna stop. You're gonna stop while the foreigners are here, so you don't make us look bad." But they're not gonna. They're not gonna keep They had other priorities.
Yeah, they have to
like a global economic crisis was kind of going on. I think the guys like slapping their bellies or something when it was hot in the summer isn't a big deal.
Belly slapping contest,
yeah,
folk festival or something. No, but I guess perceptions is a big deal, and I think in my mind the Chinese, well, at least the government, takes that far more serious than we do. I believe they are very obsessed about imagery and as you said, the propaganda. But that's a bad word, so you have to, whatever you present it as. Is that a part of is that a Chinese thing that makes them tick, or is this a governmental thing that makes them work this way? What's the driving force behind that?
Yeah, so propaganda, it's kind of necessary for a lot of authoritarian governments, but for China, it has been a part of the Chinese state for 2,200 years more, just because the keeping things together in China, keeping everybody on the same page requires basically full-throated government language coding the whole landscape. So back in the day, that used to mean putting the Chinese language, the big bright red characters on mountainsides. Used to mean carving it into stones, carving it on the, just blanketing the world in the authoritative statements of the government. And that is still going on. And so propaganda is a dirty word to us, but there's a propaganda bureau in the upper levels of the Communist Party, and it was literally called the Propaganda Bureau.
I was going to ask you that. Is that the actual title?
Recently, they changed it to like the publicity department or something, but it's the same thing.
Right.
It is the same thing. And you're really right that it is a part of China. And here's the thing people in the West might not realize as much is that it's also a majority. Like it's aimed at the world, but a majority of this propaganda is for internal consumption. It's for the Chinese people to see, wow, our government is amazing. Wow, our government has all these great systems. Wow, we used to be a poor country. Now we're really developed.
Right.
Wow, we're so competent, because that keeps the government legitimate, right? They don't have these elections to sort of say, hey, well, we hate this guy, but he got 51 or 50.0467% of the vote. So I guess we're stuck with him for 4 years. And you get a little bit there. China runs on, we get things done. We get stuff done. And
well, that's their selling point, really. That's the appeal, I suppose, that many have. I don't know if my wording would work here, but what is someone called that loves China? Because you have like the Anglophile, you have
Chinophile.
the Francophile.
Is it
Chinophile?
No, it's a Sinophile.
Sinophile, because I was going to go initially with Chinophile, but I was like, that don't sound,
I kind of like the sound of it.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I kind of like it.
But Sinophile, so you have the Sinophiles. That's, I guess, their biggest allurement is these are people who are organized and get things done. That's sort of the presentation. Now, what's that versus the reality from what you've experienced?
Well, I think there might even be a deeper thing to that. I think that like the human species is we have both like the most amazing individuals of any species, right? There's no ducks that are Shakespeare, right? There's no, right. There's no Elon
that I've heard.
Musk,
no, I haven't.
Yeah, that I've heard either, right?
Yeah, right.
So we got that, but also we're also the most social creatures in the world, right? We're the most successful social beings in the world. We have these giant organized human systems. So I think something about humans, we really love the great geniuses, the Shakespeares, the whatever, the Elon Musk, whatever, pick the religious figures, Aquinas, wherever you want to go with it. And then on the other side, we really have some sort of deep fascination, sometimes a dark fascination with these organizations that can get things done, these groups of people, this human social element brought to its extreme. So a lot of people that love China these days, that really think it's amazing and done amazing things, I think they're really in love with what it says about what humans can do if they're all put towards some goal. I think there's something deep in that.
I believe there is a draw there. As you said, having everybody on the same page, it's like an obsession, mobilizing everything towards this one thing or one direction and to these certain schemes. And you said that this is a part of China that goes back thousands of years. I think I
Yes.
tend to agree with you. I probably don't know the depths of China the way you do, but from, the things I have read of, the thinking processes of, of Confucius and the mobilization of the different warring factions to a single empire, and they see that as a good thing, not that the others got conquered. They saw the unification as a good thing, and I watch these movies that are Chinese. I don't know if they're necessarily from the mainland China or Taiwan or Hong Kong or but with the English subtitles, but the themes are very similar of surrendering yourself to something bigger, creating something stronger, a better China, and China is better because we are a united thing. That seems to be ingrained in the soul of the people.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. So in Chinese history, the decisive moment in Chinese history was the creation of the imperial Chinese state. That was the moment. And so just to give the context for that and for Confucius and for all that stuff, before 221 BC, which was when the Qin dynasty kind of took over this the northern part of China,
right,
there was over 550 years of continuous warfare in the region. So that is twice as long as the US has been around. That would go back to before the scientific revolution, if you actually imagine that. And what's really going on is that the Chinese region, the China, what was China before it was China, there's just endemic political violence. It's very difficult to form functional, structured states. And so it just struggled and struggled and struggled. And it was basically this region in northern China is one of the bloodiest places on the face of the earth. There has been so much recurring violence there with such large populations and with so many warlords duking it out for so long that when you manage to get a warlord that manages to actually take over and bring everything together, that is the event. And so that's why a Xi Jinping these days is very much trying to show that he can keep everything together. That is what's really going on in China. So the subtitle to my book is probably going to be China Unraveled: Order and Chaos in East Asia, because what China is mostly worried about is not like the United States or Japan or whatever. It's just pure chaos, pure, unmitigated, violent, horrific chaos. And so the Chinese state, for all its totalitarian horrors, is the only ordered structure they've been able to create that can prevent this chaos from coming back. And that is why you see the Chinese state starting to clench its fist again to try and prevent things from spiraling out of control, because that's where things are sort of going under the surface.
So it's like, again, if my wording could fit, Pax Sino or something, like Pax Romani, Pax Britannia, Pax Sino. It's sort of like this strengthened entity that can bring even if necessary, coerced peace in the region. This is still kind of stamped on their legacy, their psyche, right? To where the fear is that if we don't have this controlling power, we devolve into a chaos and you have everybody competing and tearing each other apart. That's like what they want to avoid, right?
Yeah, 100%. And the really key thing too is everybody likes to talk about the Chinese, the Celestial Kingdom, and the tribute system, and how everybody was sort of giving obeisance and kowtowing to the emperor. And that's kind of all true. But the real secret behind all this is that China is an empire, not because it conquered other people, but because it conquered China, the pieces of China. Right. China didn't go around and never conquered Japan. It did all sorts of ritual invasions of Korea, but they didn't last too long. And it tried to conquer Vietnam 4 times, but it didn't last. Right. It failed each time. Right. So the actual empire is really the pieces of China. So people got to remember, China is enormous, right? It's over 1 billion people. Yeah. And there are multiple provinces that have more people than most countries, right? Over 100 million people in all these countries, more than any country in Europe. So these in any other place on earth would be different states. But in China, that grand
like
imperial
countries.
state were like,
Yeah.
the Chinese center, the political center in China says, nah, you are part of us, because otherwise we're all going to rip each other's throats out.
So is that I guess the driving tension behind Taiwan? Do they see it as a thread that if it gets pulled a little too hard unravels this harmony of China?
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on with Taiwan, but that whole southern coast of China, from basically south of Shanghai all the way to Hong Kong, there's a lot of small city-state, basically what used to be city-states there, these kind of coastal port cities like Hong Kong,
Right.
that frequently don't mesh with the Chinese fold, right? There's actually multiple languages they speak there that aren't Chinese, Cantonese being the most prominent one, right? The people in Hong Kong speak a different language than northern China. And then Taiwan itself is like the worst of all of these, right? It's a big island. It's not just a little city on the coast. It's like a big island off the coast.
Yeah.
And Taiwan has not been a part of China for very long, but not really less than 500 years. And this has happened before. So what happened go back to basically the 1600s here, you're transitioning between the Ming dynasty to the Qing dynasty, which is it's like a massive civil war, right? That's what we're really talking about. It's not like the transition. It's like,
it wasn't like an election turnover.
Yeah, it wasn't an election. It's like, nah, the dudes came in on horses and started slaughtering people.
Right.
And what happened actually is big merchant trading fleets and families from the South actually moved to Taiwan. And they actually did the exact same thing that the nationalists did in the 1940s. And they fled when they lost the war. They lost the mainland. They fled to Taiwan. And then the government had to conquer them, and it took a while and blah, blah, blah. The problem with the Taiwan thing these days is the U.S. Navy didn't let it happen. China would have. Mao was launching missiles and artillery rocket, everything. But you can't get past the U.S. Navy. At least they could not in the entire 20th century.
Right. Is there a different then mindset with those living in Taiwan versus the mainland regarding their Chinese history?
That's a very good question. Yeah, the sense of history, I'll be honest, the sense of history in China is very troubled across the board, right? What has happened is that this powerful Chinese state, we already talked about how there's all these different regions, and they'd be different countries than any other place on earth. Well, the history is written by the winners, and the central government has basically flattened and drowned out all these other stories and things going on in China. So it tells this history of a single, unitary, powerful people and state, sort of like a phoenix, reviving itself through every new dynasty throughout history. But that's not honest. That's not true. So yes, the short answer is the Taiwanese sense of being Chinese is kind of just, I wouldn't say this, the political sense of it is kind of messed up.
Yeah. Well, and I was curious about the historical tie, because I was wondering what you were just pointing at when you have a ministry of information or propaganda. Churning out the historical account as you're supposed to hear it. It's by design meant to put you in a certain mind frame, right? How much of the history is being presented is really history versus convenient party line, and like you said, all the things that are kind of pressed down and not brought up, though it is a part of their history. Do you think I guess let me put it this way: are there things in Chinese history that if the Chinese kind of more focused on would maybe change this mindset we're talking about?
It would destroy China, probably.
It would destroy. Well, give me an example. I'm curious now.
Let's just talk. Let's kind of broaden this out for a bit, right? So let's just use the U.S. as an example. I don't talk about U.S. domestic politics and stuff because it's not what I'm about right now. But just in general, in the 20th century, we've sort of expanded the idea of like what America is, right? It's like, oh, there's all these different threads that all came together, right? And there's different people here and all this. And for various reasons, you can do that. You probably should have a strong single thread that kind of unites the people. But all around the world, the question of history has become very complicated. We're trying to sort of create multiple threads in this history to show that there's many peoples and they all came together and it's more of a mosaic or something, right? In China, if you try and do this, you are going to rupture the Chinese state, right? Because the way this worked is that quite literally, China went around these northern Chinese, this region, basically the Qin area, northern China, went around and they conquered everything around them. And that meant destroying languages, eradicating local identities, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Like, it's stuff that people might consider similar to like Native Americans or something. If you want to use obviously not a totally good example,
right?
But they actually use this in China. They'll often say blah 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 blah. The Native Americans in the United States, blah blah blah. Blah. You know, they do that stuff. Yeah. But yeah, this question of like what to do with history is profound in China, and you're really hitting something. And yeah, I mean, the core of it is it would unravel this powerful ordered state for all its totalitarian impulses, propaganda, everything. It is the thing that brought coherence and order to China throughout history. And if you start saying that all these dynasties are really just the sort of the state of the winners and they don't represent all of China, you really are breaking down the actual foundations of the Chinese identity, political identity.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Well, I'm curious for the brief time that democracy was tried in mainland China, did that have any effect at all? Was that absolutely stamped out, or is there kind of embers growing here or there that kind of led Tiananmen? I mean, is there still that tension there, ignored, or how's that work?
Democracy would not work in China. This is where people don't know, like, is he conservative? Is he liberal? Is he this? Is he that? It's not this. It's like, it's more, we need to learn like that certain places aren't going to become certain things, right? Iraq isn't going to become a democracy. Russia's not going to become a democracy. And China for sure isn't going to become a democracy. Just an example, 1911, this was the last Chinese dynasty. The Qing dynasty collapsed, right? And they created democracy. They had a republic and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, it was a revolution, but it wasn't what happened. It wasn't really a democratic revolution. What happened was a devolution. Basically, the Chinese, large Chinese imperial state just ruptured and it broke into pieces, and warlords formed in all of the same different regions of China that they've formed in for the last 3,000 years. So that's what happens. You cannot bring these pieces together. So this is where, if people want to look, I have a course coming out about this. I have a podcast. I have videos that try to show this stuff because it's hard to sort of describe. You have to see it, and you see it repeated throughout history again and again. But democracy would not work in China. And this is where all these people for the last couple of decades are like, oh yeah, if we make them rich, of course they'll become democratic. It's like, what are you talking about? It's like, this was always so ridiculous. And we're now seeing what happens when things get tough in China. Xi Jinping is doing exactly what, I don't agree. It's not like I agree with him, but I'm saying from the perspective of Chinese history, you better tighten the hatches here. What, you suddenly allow in democracy? Basically, China had a choice. 2015, are we going to go for democracy or are we going to go for dictatorship? And they chose 100% dictatorship because they know it would all just crumble. I mean, it's obvious. If you look at the tensions, the social tensions, political tensions, just every economic tensions within China, they're so profound. And the thing that the single, unitary, powerful one China does is it allows us to sort of ignore those, or it sort of puts them under the rug. So no one knows about all these tensions within China. I'm here talking about China's got like 12 different pieces in it, and they're all fighting and they hate each other, and everyone else is like, oh, well, it just looks like a really big, red, scary country on a map to me. But it's different under the surface. And so that's what we got to start to understand, because let's say things went bad in China. This is what would happen. It would break into multiple sort of warring states, basically. It would be the same old story. And just often this helps for sort of more of a conservative audience, where in general, when you look at, like, say, I wouldn't say like a Biden type person, or Democrats who were around in the 90s when China was sort of more entering the more globalized world economy, like post Cold War. This was when it was just an absolute, like, Shanghai was a mud pit, right? All these grand villages on the coast were fishing villages, like this kind of thing, right? And they saw all these tensions, and they realized all the massive problems that lurk within China. And there's a lot of people in the sort of national security sphere. They've been around a long time. They know this stuff. And so they've been very accommodating, but they didn't see how far things would go. They didn't see how far they thought it would fail, honestly, in a lot of ways at some point along the line. But now there's a real tension. And so I always feel like that's helpful to understand. There are people who know this stuff, but now you can't even talk about it. Because if I start saying, well, and I'm actually not saying this, I think China is a threat and there's many ways that it should be addressed and all that. But if I start saying, yeah, that's true, but also this place is a mess. There are so many problems in here. Like, just wait, like all sorts of locusts and flies and all sorts of crazy things would spew out if I started telling you what was really under the surface here.
Right. The reference to 1911, I guess, is what I was kind of looking at, is that kind of shows to the Chinese mind what happens if you remove the iron fist. You break into a bunch of warlords. The country it's like it was back in that time where all these warring states are going at each other's throats, a time of chaos and upheaval. That's why we have to have the iron hand, right? And that's why democracy is probably difficult there. And I've believed that for quite some time. Our version and understanding of democracy can't be just kind of thrown at another place and it works just like that. It's from a different, we have a different history, mindsets, and viewpoints that we don't possess of theirs. And you're explaining these here. So you believe now, and I think I do, but you believe now that there are still, for lack of a better word, potential warring factions in China that, if you would remove the central power, would just start going at each other.
Well, it's not just the central power. I mean, typically, so all these states, towards the end of when things get really tough, they tend to tighten their fist, right? But that hasn't prevented any of them from eventually falling. And you can't go back and say, hey, Song Dynasty, you'd really have stopped the Mongols if this had happened. Or, hey, Ming Dynasty, or they all failed for all sorts of reasons. And no little change would have really changed it. And often the act of closing that fist, just gripping everything tighter, makes a lot of things way more difficult. Right now, China's doing this and it's limiting its tech sector, right? It needs tech to bring AI and electronic vehicles and all this stuff. But right now it's so concerned with authority and control that it's squashing the very innovative forces it would need to secure its position in all sorts of areas across all these regions of self-reliance it would need.
So is this a part of the not getting the other half of their history? I mean, the tighter you grip, the more problems you've really caused, and you don't necessarily avoid this feared Armageddon that you're looking for anyway? Is it because they only get the polished version of look at what we accomplished that they do this? All that just straight up close the fist, because they're hurting themselves with extreme lockdowns. It hurts their economy. The tech sector is hurting. You've written in an article where their energy needs are like way past our energy needs, and they have a lot of things, and you're trying to juggle it with a centralized control that it cannot be easy. They got a lot of moving parts that maybe we don't recognize on the surface, do we?
Definitely. I mean, the number of things that the central government has to try and manage top down for over 1 billion people, it's insane, right? You got to do the banking sector. You got to do the consumer economy. You got to do the whole real estate sector is kind of imploding right now. You have to do all your import export stuff. You have to do the high tech stuff. You have to do it's across the board, your agriculture, energy. It's all these systems like I was talking about. And you're 100% right. No one can keep on top of all of this forever, right? You ideally need some sort of system that could do it in a distributed, local, sort of from the ground up, things could somehow be managed sort of way, right? Problem in China, you're right that they don't recognize the dual history, right? You have order and you have chaos. You got to talk about both, right? You are dishonest if you're just saying we're a super powerful, eternal, immortal state. Yeah, please. Yes. But at the same time, these are problems, these underlying tensions, these systemic problems. They're bigger in a lot of ways. Forget the Communist Party for a second. Forget that. The current Chinese state, one thing it was trying to do was to use all of the industrial and digital and electronic and electrical tools of the modern world to try and overcome the sort of deep foundational challenges that kept China in pieces, that kept it divided, that kept it extremely undeveloped. And we've seen what it's done, right? It's incredible, right? On that basic level we were talking about, where like there's this social element to the human animal. We're like, wow, look at that group. Look what they managed to do. That's impressive. China's done some impressive things on that sense. But the truth is, it just hasn't been enough. That is, it's all this work, all this infrastructure, all these high-speed rails, all the airports, all the ports, all the electrical grids, all the manufacturing, the factories, the military development, all of it still isn't enough. And here's the other ironic thing. This grand Chinese state, which is super powerful compared to like any other state, is still not powerful enough for what China needs, because these tensions within the country are that deep and powerful.
I can't help but make a comparison with Imperial Japan. Coming out of that, coming from a backward state, if you will, because China was like, was being carved up, still had ancient protocols prohibiting, being efficient in a lot of ways and turning on itself or whatnot. European powers are taking advantage of it. Here you have, I compare it with China, or I'm sorry, Japan, coming out of its medieval era, wanting to mobilize or to modernize quickly, adopts all these Western ways.
It actually sounded cool. It sounded like it was a gong.
Like a gong, right? Yeah,
Japan.
That was not a Chinese gong. That was not by stage, right? But yeah, you have. So I mean,
war drums.
War drum. I need a war drum back sound thing, right? But like they have railways, we'll build them. They have ships, we'll build ships. They have telegraphs, we'll build telegraphs. But they had to like totally reinvent their society at a very alarming, disturbing pace with an overarching government. And there's always this obsession of, we got to catch up to the West. We got to catch up to the West. We need to build our own empire. Japan, energy needs, right? That's what led to them attacking us in World War II. Now I look at China. They're kind of like trying. It's almost like they have this same mentality of, we have to catch up to the West. We have to, we're a great empire. We're a great people. We need to overcome this. But there always seems to be this element where they're just short, which to me kind of worries me. Does that make them desperate enough to do what Japan to grab what they need? Like you were mentioning, the energy needs. That's a huge problem. Don't have energy, and what they have built would just collapse. Yep. I mean, I can see that pushing them to do things that, well, might catch some people off guard.
Yeah, definitely. And the Japan connection is really important. Japan developed for a long time, sort of in the image of China. All these systems were built from China. And a lot of its history kind of before the 19th century was a bit of this warring Japan sort of situation.
That's right.
It did mirror China. The big difference is that basically Japan managed to do what China has not managed to do. It actually managed to bring all the people together. So if you look at Japan, it is a homogenous country, really. I mean, it's Japan for Japanese people, right? And it's very clear what it is, and they really did integrate the whole country. Yes. And there's a lot of right. I mean, it's democratic. It can have elections. It doesn't have this sort of overbearing state. It was managed to transition. There's a lot of things going on with Japan that really, really worked. And the truth is, it managed to do it. I mean, Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. It's larger than any European country, right? It achieved its thing. But you are right. It has a deep, deep, profound resource challenge. And the reason it was able to function after 1945 is because the U.S. said, all right, we nuked you and occupied you, but we're going to give you all your needs. Yeah. Right. But we're going to meet all your needs. And so basically Japan afterwards, here's the funny thing. Japan afterwards got a better deal than its empire gave them, right?
Exactly.
China's problem now is that its needs are so big across everything. Like that article, right? I talk about energy. It's like, good luck getting all this energy. Just try who are you going to invade to get all this energy? You need it from everywhere, right? And it's like this across the board, right? This is the challenge of building, right? Population scale. We always think, wow, the bigger the country, the better. Right. No, typically the bigger the country, the poorer, right?
More headaches to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like feeding them and clothing people and giving the energy and educating them. It's all a mess. And in China, bringing things to China scale, right? To just making 600 modern cities in the last 30 years or whatever. And just everything they've done to keep all those moving pieces we're talking about functioning, lubricated and moving and oiled and ready to go. It's a nightmare. And you can't actually, because you're right, there is a strong sense where if China gets desperate, China gets, if it needs to solve one of these problems, why won't it go reach out and take what it needs, kind of like Japan during that period? And up till now, the US has done the same thing for China that it did for Japan. It said, hey, China, you get with us against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, back in that detente with Nixon, and we'll let all the stuff you need flow into your country. US Navy's not going to do a thing. It's all going to be fine. Just leave Taiwan alone. Kind of don't do this, don't do that, and we can get on fine. And that's what's going on now. It's the kind of this US system around the world that enables things to flow and reach China, right? All this stuff. Like if India started saying, oh, you fought us in the Himalayas, well, we're not going to allow any of these energy shipments to make it to your ports. I mean, this is a disaster. This is why China has this intense antagonism. It has this deep sense of pride and the sense of its own ascendance. And there's a triumphalist narrative associated with it. Yeah. All this stuff. Yeah. But you need everybody. You need everybody. That's the difference.
That is the difference. I was just reading an article today regarding the conflicts with along the border between China and India, which I want to say was within a year or two, where they had a big fight break out fighting over the border and who gets what or whatnot. And I mean, there's still that potential for conflict. It's almost as if they've antagonized everybody around them, yet they need them. And it seems to me they're still playing they're using money. I'm not sure where they're getting it. Maybe us. They're taking money and they're buying friends, I guess, further out, but they still have ticked everyone else around them, and they still have made other powers kind of weary of them. It's almost like they're putting themselves in a position that's just going to end bad anyway.
It is very hard to see what China's doing and to not see a situation where it ends bad. And just to clear stuff up with the money thing. Everyone's looked at China like, how do they afford all this stuff, right? And there's a lot of reasons, but one thing is everybody's been all upset about fiat money and stuff these days. But the truth is 90% of money isn't made because the government invents it, right? Prints it. It's made through credit. You put money in a bank and they can loan out basically 90% of it. You keep loaning it out, you end up with all this money that's just created as credit. That's what happened. So that is what China has mostly done. And the way it's supercharged.
So it's just inflationary currency that they're just spending. Is that what it is?
Yeah, they got a currency. They have more. They've been pumping out currency in there like you wouldn't believe. They got way more currency of yuan in China than we have US, even though the dollar is used all around the world. It is by far the most overcapitalized, insane currency thing anyone's ever seen. And it can work for a while, right? So the way this works is, let's say the US didn't interact with all these other countries, right? Forget all these, it's just the US by itself. What you'd want is a currency that kind of matches your economic use, right? So you have like about all that, you even it out. And the government will be like, no, we'll make more. That's what they'll do. They'll be like, hey, we want a little bit more. So you got to juice this. And it's bad. But roughly speaking, if you just had a country that was kind of its own thing, you could balance this out. It's when you start sending your money this way and across the world and this way, and suddenly a country holds a bunch of your money or it has the debt of your government, all this stuff. This is where things get really complicated. And in China, the fact that the yuan is not very internationalized, it's almost all inside China, has given them a lot of advantages in this regard. And the fact that they have had they had a current account surplus with the rest of the world. So they basically took in more exported more than they imported for years. That was also a really good thing. But what happened starting in 2017, COVID has kind of flipped it for a little bit because everybody needs everything from China. But in general, the current account surplus is running in the red now because of what we were talking about. China needs all this stuff, not just energy. It needs agriculture. It needs basically everything everywhere. And that is limiting all of the import, right? It's making all the exports it does. It's lowering the balance, right? It's like, well, we just got to keep buying more to keep everything going. And that has been a real change. And at some point, this will obviously impact its currency. But for right now, that's what's been happening. Basically, China's been able to use credit. It injects credit into industries like you wouldn't believe. It's like if the government was like, wow, we don't have enough cantaloupes. Let's just give every company anything that says they'll be involved in the cantaloupe industry, a lot of credit from the state banks.
Right. So I've seen China used as an example to justify the MTT economic theory, where you can just basically, The idea is they kind of simplify. The governments print their own money anyway. Just print what you need, and then just take it back here and there to manage inflation. Blah blah blah. Do you see cracks in this approach in China right now? I mean, you
Well,
kind of hinted to it, but I mean, is this something that's really going to explode at some point?
yeah. Also for the modern monetary theory thing,
Yeah.
that's a very interesting theory. Maybe that means we don't need taxes, right? If that's true, let's just get rid of taxes, right? What do we need those for?
Yeah, hey,
We can all
just
just
print
be,
money. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But for China, yeah, this comes out in the place where this will usually come out is typically the real estate sector, right? So we had this big blow up 2008, 2009. So why does this happen? It's always like, why finance problems come into real estate? Well, finance runs on collateral, right? That's how you back your loans. So basically what banks do is they take in deposits and they send out and they give out loans. And what they want to secure all those loans with is typically physical stuff. And this is what has basically wedded the finance industry to the real estate markets forever in basically every country. And typically banks form in sort of river valleys around nice farmland. And they basically just take they use the farmland as the collateral for the fund. And that's kind of what happens way back in the day. But for this, you basically get problems in the real estate sector. You just get insane debt just being spewed out in mortgages and all sorts of places in real estate because it's like the go-to for any bank when they don't know what else to do, basically. And it's the collateral. It's also the loans. And the way things work in China, you just have really insane real estate development processes going on. So there's capital, there's basically industry, like heavy machinery and all these capital projects and rivers and dams and stuff like that. And then you have some exports. And then you just have the really crazy other thing is just real estate, construction. All this stuff is where the sink that they put the money into. So if people are looking for a place where this kind of stuff will blow up, like here, you'll often see it in real estate. And we've been seeing real problems in Chinese real estate. This is basically over $50 trillion bubble, just for your listeners to understand. This is insane. There's never been probably any bubble anywhere ever in history that is this big. That's just the way I think about the Chinese property sector. You go look at an image, you see ghost cities and stuff like that, but you can just personal experience. If you just take a train, like anywhere in China to any other city in China, you're like, oh, I'm going from city A to city B. But along the way, you'll often see just not in a city, you'll just see rows, like as far as the eye can see, apartment forests, towers and towers of apartments just along a railway, right? Not even in any real city. And a lot of times they're just there. They're just all thrown up. They all look exactly the same. This is really insane. And local governments get revenue from real estate, right? So there's a lot of really twisted incentives here. And it's crazy. It's really, really crazy. I mean, I have a long video on it that actually I think got cut off at the end, but there needs to be a massive readjustment in the Chinese property sector. And that is going to impact finance. It's going to impact a lot of things. But that's definitely a place to look, although there's a lot of problems throughout China. And just the way the export system is changing as COVID is changing supply chains. It's encouraging every nation or group of nations like the EU to renationalize or relocalize basically a lot of supply chains. Right. It's no longer just in time. It's like we need to have redundancy, resiliency, domestic production. This is happening across the world. And well, where does the world's factory belong in this scenario, right?
Yep, going to change factories look like. But so you mentioned property in China. I'm very curious about this. It seems they do, but they don't. Do they have private property in China? Is it all state owned? Who owns the real estate? Who buys it? Do they still give out houses, or you got to pay for it? How does all this work together in China?
Right. So in the 1990s, they opened up the property market. It was totally state owned, like you said. And basically they have we'd call it like a secondary market. So technically everything is still owned, is still like leased from the Communist Party, but it functions as if you own it, right? So you basically buy and sell, and they have a secondary market, like, because everything's technically still owned by the state, but it's basically work something like property rights since the 90s. It's been functionally like property rights, but yes, at the deepest core of it, like it is not quite that. And it's basically function like that. But you're right. Yeah, there's the question of how did this giant communist state where where the state owns the property have all this property thing? That's just another sort of weird, bizarre ideological contradiction at the heart of things. But It's been functionally working as if, you have developers, they And often what happens is the province will own land. It'll just give it to the developer. It's actually allowed so much corruption, it would blow your skull.
Oh, I can imagine pretty big, but
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome to the essay segment. Talking with Jason, you can see that there is a lot to China. We've done a pretty long interview by comparison to most people I've had as guests. This interview is going to actually be broken up into two segments. You're going to have a part one and a part two because we went on for a good length of time talking about this. So I'm going to go ahead and just comment on the first portion of the interview that you're going to hear and primarily focus on a few things that we discussed in this first half of the interview with Jason. First off, it's this idea of propaganda. It's propaganda is still a thing. I believe in the Western mind that there's this idea that we think, oh, propaganda is silly. That's Joseph Goebbels stuff. We're much smarter now. We're not going to fall for it anymore. That's what these other crazy places like China and North Korea they do that, but everyone else knows it's foolish. That's a faulty mindset. It really is. Propaganda is still being used. And it's just we use different terminology in the West than they do over there. As Jason was saying, it was literally called the Ministry of Propaganda. I mean, they didn't hide the fact that that's what it is. Apparently, they've renamed it to something else, but it's the same thing. I mean, it's viewed as a tool for the government and the powers that be to control things. In the end, that's what propaganda is. Propaganda is putting your message forward over and over again until it becomes the official stance, the official explanation for everything, and thus anything contrary becomes, contraband. It becomes blacklisted. It becomes the enemy. Now, in the West, we have a different terminology for this. We call it controlling the narrative. Maybe, if you're from an older generation, maybe you've heard terms like wagging the dog rather than wagging the tail. You grab the tail and wag the dog. You get it to do what you want it to do, right? You get ahead of the story. You want to present the facts the way you want it presented, and then you have all these. They broke it down to science of there's these cycles that the news cycles and how they run and how to strategically place your message or prevent someone from placing their message to get the official version out, and that's what makes you legitimate, makes you right, it gives you leverage over your opponent, and in the end, that's what it comes down to, right? Leverage. How can I control those I want to control? Well, one of the ways you do it, enter propaganda. That's how you do it. You control and manipulate what people are allowed to hear. You suppress any contrary message through a variety of means to where no one can hear anything contrary. And after a while, that's the only story floating around. And even if people don't like hearing it or don't believe it, it's still the only thing out there, and there's nothing else contrary to mobilize around. Now, propaganda is just not simply, this is what you're supposed to believe and we'll tell you. I mean, that's pretty old school. But there's more to it than that. It could be done in such subtle ways that you're not even aware of it. And one of the ways that this is done, and I believe it's being done here in our nation, is you control the narrative of your history, and thus you control people's attitudes and mindsets in the setting that you want them to be in. There's a mindset amongst many that history's history. It doesn't matter. If you have the far leftist communist view, history isn't important, doesn't exist anyway. Just eradicate it, erase it, whatever. But even they understand that you have to rewrite history because we look back to it. It has an effect. It forms you. It's a part of history is part of every culture. History is even a part of every language. There's history involved with religion. There's history involved with political thought. These things carry on legacies that have impact on how people think, act, and react to things. But if you can control the historical narrative, well, now maybe you can control the results of that legacy and the effect that it has. It gets you. Think of the madness that we're setting in, where there are literally groups of people, and by groups I don't mean like there's this massive, representative body deciding this. You have a handfuls of people wielding power, determining what you get to hear and not hear, and coerce you and guide you into thinking and acting in certain ways. I'm not just talking about China. I'm talking about here. When you have conglomerates who are in the hands of a few people dictating the mass amount of information you're allowed to receive, even if the government's not running it, it is still a monopolistic propaganda machine. It won't allow itself to be challenged. Anything that pops up, they either buy it out or they try to discredit it. Controlling information is not just a political tool. It's a money maker. It is a money maker. And that tends to, merge with the politics, doesn't it? As you were listening, the history of China is often, the polished version is presented as this, this unified entity overcoming chaos and destruction. And, because they're able to mobilize and work together, they pull themselves out of that darkness, out of that dark age, right? But that's not the full story. It's all held together by force. And if that force can no longer hold it, it'll fragment. And this is despite years of force and surveillance and oppression to make people conform to this Chinese ideal, the view that they want you to have and be. Despite that, the minute you remove that force, it all comes crumbling down like a house of cards. Now, if you're the one wielding that propaganda and controlling that history and wielding that power, the stakes are pretty high for you, aren't they? You're going to take drastic measures to not let it unravel. Because once you start pulling at that one thread, the next thing you know, the whole shirt is coming off. But many of you would probably take comfort and say, well, yeah, that's over there. That's China's problem. We have nothing to worry about here. But, you're buying into the propaganda, I suppose. You have to pay attention to what's going on. The big media is jealous of its power. It's in the hands of a few people, and it controls what most people here in the nation. That fact alone should bother you. The arguments against social media, where do you think most of them is being spearheaded from? Take a wild guess. That's right, the big media. They don't want no contenders, especially when others call them out in their falsehoods. They want to control the narrative. So this is irregardless of who you think controls the narrative. And I want these people to have to say, not these people. If that's your attitude, you're part of the problem, by the way. But the thing is you have a handful of people who honestly don't care about you, dictating what you get to hear as being the official account. Now, that should bother you. If it don't, you're surrendering your legacy, your history, in what has made this nation not like China. Our history is also important. This obsession with lens and this obsession with, presenting the history to foment a political conclusion rather than just look at what happened in history is insane. And it's nothing more than another version of propaganda. It is why it must be challenged. It is why it must be defended. We have the United States as it is, both good and bad, but I'll take that over communist China any day.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.